Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Zoominar producer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, a wide-open conversation with author and linguist Deborah Tannen and political scientist Norman Ornstein. Please note that today's session is being recorded, and the link will be available later this week. We will take some of your questions at the end of the program, so please type them in the Q&A box. Following today's program, be sure to visit Moment's website to read engaging articles on a variety of topics. You'll also be able to view past programs and sign up for next week's Zoominar, Musical Memories of Elie Wiesel, where we will celebrate what would have been Elie's 92nd birthday. Please join Moment Editor-in-Chief Nadine Epstein for Conversation and Song with Rabbi Ariel Berger, Cantor Deborah Kachko-Gray, Zamir Choral Foundation founder Matthew Lazar, and Cantor Joseph Malavani. Now for today's program. Deborah Tannen, a professor of linguistics at Georgetown University, is best known as the author of You Just Don't Understand, Women and Men in Conversation, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for nearly 4 years. Other New York Times bestsellers include You Were Always Mom's Favorite, about adult sisters, and You're Wearing That, about mothers and grown daughters. In addition to being featured in most major newspapers and magazines, Dr. Tannen is a frequent guest on television and radio news and information shows, including The Colbert Report, Oprah, 2020, and many NPR shows like All Things Considered. Her doctoral dissertation and first linguistics book were about New York Jewish conversational style. Her play, An Act of Devotion, about returning with her father to Warsaw, where he was born, is included in the Best American Short Plays 1993-94. And today, you will hear more about Deborah's just published book, Finding My Father, his century-long journey from World War I Warsaw and my quest to follow. Joining Deborah today is Norman Ornstein. Norman Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He is a contributing author and writer for The Atlantic and has been an election eve analyst for CBS News and BBC News. He is also chairman of the board of the Campaign Legal Center. Dr. Ornstein was elected as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2004 and was spotlighted as one of 2012's 100 top global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. Norman's family foundation, the Matthew Harris Ornstein Memorial Foundation, sponsors a summer debate institute for public school kids in the Washington area through the Washington Urban Debate League and created and funded the documentary, The Definition of Insanity, that was broadcast on PBS this past April. His New York Times bestselling books include It's Even Worse Than It Looks, How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism, and One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. It is my pleasure to welcome Deborah Tannen and Norman Ornstein.
Thanks so much, Suzanne, and it's a great pleasure to be here with my dear friend, Deborah Tannen, to talk about this quite marvelous and remarkable book, Finding My Father. And Deborah, the first question I want to ask you is the genesis of the book. This didn't just spring forth in the last couple of years. It wasn't something that you woke up one morning and said, I think I'll do a book about my father. It goes back decades. So talk a bit about what motivated you to write the book and why that journey was such a long one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Norm. Yeah, so I guess it's my 13th book, and probably took me longer, sometimes I think, than all the others put together, but certainly longer than any other. I adored my father, and when I was a kid, I missed him. He wasn't there. He worked in a factory. He worked as a cutter in the garment industry, although he was a lawyer, but he finished law school in the Depression. Could say more about his background later. Yeah. And he was very active in politics. So if he wasn't working in the factory, then he was being active, as we called it, in New York's Liberal Party. So when he retired, he had time in a way that he didn't before. And he loved talking about his past. He was born into a Hasidic household in Warsaw and had astonishingly detailed memories. He would talk about people and incidents, and the play that I wrote, which is about going back to Warsaw with him. After I wrote the play, I realized that it was his voice and mine, him remembering his childhood, my remembering mine. I realized all the memories in there happened to him before he was 6. So he had this astonishing interest in Warsaw. So in the beginning, I thought, and I think he really encouraged this. In fact, I found references in letters, and he saved every letter that he ever got and many that he wrote. He often kept copies. So I read in a letter that he wrote to someone back in, I think, 1979, that he had suggested to Deborah that she write a book about about his Warsaw, the Jewish Warsaw. So it started that way. I thought that I would capture that Jewish community of Warsaw that in my mind had been destroyed by the Nazis in World War II, although I read a lot more about it in writing the book and realized really the era that he lived, World War I. He was born, I said, in 1908, and so he was there before, during, and after World War I. That really was the twilight of Jewish Warsaw. So that's how it started. But then as I began spending so many hours with him, and he gave me materials that he had written, journals that he had kept before he married, and then he began writing his memories, and I gave him a tape recorder and cassettes. He began dictating them. I realized that his life really reflected the century. He lived to be 98. So pretty much the entire 20th century, and reflected so many of the major events of the 20th century. So World War I, again, as it occurred in Warsaw, the Bolshevik Revolution, and he actually was very influenced by an aunt who was only 6 years older, so she was more like an older sister, who became an active communist. We can talk more about that. So when he came to this country, he was already a communist. I have his FBI file. Then how he managed to quit high school at 14 and yet become a lawyer. He ran for Congress. So his life, I began to see, really reflected the whole century, especially from the perspective of an East European Jewish immigrant. And the fact that he came at the tail end of that massive influx of East European Jews to the United States. So he came in 1920. That was the last year that there were no limits on immigration from Eastern Europe. And of course, it was a time of tremendous anti-immigrant sentiment, which is why quotas were then instituted. So it was a combination of wanting to take advantage of these memories that he had of Warsaw, write about the way his life reflected all these events. And, I kind of realized writing it was a way to get him back and spend time with him. And once I had decided that I was going to write this book, I was very serious about it in the mid-90s. That's when it got really serious for me. So I'm a workaholic. I would never take time out in the middle of the day to go talk to my parents. But once this was my book to write, I spent many hours with my father in the middle of the day talking to him about his past. And so it was licensed to spend all that time with him then. And then as I worked on all those materials over the many years since, to keep him with me. A last comment I'll make, at one point it occurred to me maybe I was kind of like Penelope, who kept saying that she would remarry after she had finished weaving the shroud, but she pulled it out at night. That maybe I thought if I never finished the book about my father, he couldn't die. He would have to wait so that he could tell me more stories.
So, one thing that I found so striking, you mentioned that he started out believing that you could do a book about Warsaw, that place that he loved so much, even though he left it at a young age. And I want to talk a little bit more about the fact that it wasn't all sweetness and light for him in Warsaw, or more generally. But this is really a book about his entire life, including all of his warts and all of the things that you could say are fairly embarrassing. But he opened himself up to all of it, didn't want to censor any of it. And just talk a little bit about, he's such a remarkable man, was such a remarkable man. a genius in so many ways. You can't read this book without just being blown away by his drive and his talents. But what do you think it was that made him decide that, of course, probably after he was going to be gone, but that every element of his life, including the embarrassing parts, were open to being written about for everybody to read?
Yeah, I asked him at one point why he was willing to talk to me so much. And he said, I think maybe it's pent up words. He loved talking about the past. My mother wasn't interested in it. He was witty. He made funny comments about it. He said, well, she's like normal people. She wants to talk about the present. To me, it isn't real unless it's in the past. And apparently my mother made a rule with him, no talk about dead people. But he only wanted to talk about dead people. So I think part of it is I was the one who was interested and wanted to listen. And a lot of it is material he wrote for me. I had the thought at one point, he spoke Yiddish, Polish, English, and he read Hebrew, but his native language was writing. He was most comfortable expressing himself in writing. When I used to call on the phone, if my mother wasn't there, he would talk to me. But if she was, he would say, oh, mother will be so happy to talk to you. I'll get her. And then next thing I knew, I was talking to my mother and he'd be gone. But when he was 80, I taught him to use a computer. And he wrote out long, long things. And then he learned email. And so he would write me long emails. So I think part of it was, I felt that he was the parent I had an affinity with, that when I said something, he understood how I meant it. If I asked him a question, he would answer with patience and precision. I think he may have felt that way about me, that he could say anything and I would accept it and understand it and still love him. So I guess it was an outlet for him too. I initially intended to write this book while he was alive. And he commented, if you write it while I'm alive, you're going to have to be thinking about my feelings.
Yeah.
I came across the note. I kept notes on our conversations and recorded many of them. I have 200 cassette tapes of either interviews or conversations. But I remember coming across this after he was gone and thinking, yeah, I'm still thinking about your feelings, but not so much how they're going to be when he reads it, but I wanted to know what his feelings were when he did all these things in his life.
So he had lots of ups and downs during the course of his life. And one thing that I was curious about as I read it, there were decisions that he made that ended up being bad decisions. There were decisions that he made where his life would have been dramatically different if it had gone another way. He dwelled a lot on the past. Did he dwell a lot on those missed opportunities or bad decisions? Did he have a lot of regrets? I will say, just as an aside, one of the things that really struck me, we'll talk more about his relationships, including with your mother, including elements of your mother that got her to marry him. But it was so striking to see the depth of love that he felt. He didn't seem to have any regrets about that. What about some of those decisions that he made that otherwise, including jobs, were pretty damaging?
Yes, he never expressed any regret about marrying my mother, and it was clear that he really, really loved her. So many lovely scenes. They were married 71 years, and in my mind, I can see them sitting, waiting for that dining room to open up in the, it was not assisted living, but senior residence where they lived.
Yeah.
Both in wheelchairs and holding hands across the wheelchair. And another one, scene 6 in my mind. I was visiting, he at that point needed a walker. And I'm sitting with my mother in the living room and he comes in with his walker and he isn't heading to the chair he usually sits in. He's heading toward my mother and she said, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to give you a kiss, which he did and then went to his chair. To answer, no, he did not express any regret about that, although lots of misgivings I'll tell you about that I read in the journal
Yes.
before he made the decision. But when he retired, had got this notebook in which he was going to write his memories. The way he began was listing all the jobs that he held and the kinds of work that he did. It came to 68. When I thought about my father's life and trying to understand it, to me, the question was relationships. I wanted to understand why he married my mother, his relationships with his mother and sister, of course, the relationships with all these people he left back in Warsaw. His view of his life was the work that he did. And I eventually came to understand that maybe it was also about relationships, because for him, marriage and family was first and foremost obligation.
Yeah.
Throughout my life, I asked, what do I want to do? He never, ever asked what he wanted to do. He only asked what he had to do. So he saw his life as all these jobs that he held. And they're fascinating, and again, that memory, every one of them, he wrote down who he worked with, scenes from the work. He could have written a book about any one of them. I had a handful of jobs. I could probably tell you like 3 stories about each one. But there was one that really did, in his mind, doom him in many ways. So, okay, central fact of his life, he had no father. Father died of tuberculosis when he was very young, another very common element of that era, of that time. And so when he came to this country at 12, he immediately went to work. When he was 14, he quit high school and went to work full-time in the garment district. And I always knew that. I didn't really understand what it meant. He took high school equivalency tests one by one, passed a law school qualifying exam, went to law school at night, and at 19, graduated from law school. He expected at that time then to be able to earn his living as a lawyer. It was the Depression. There was no chance of getting a job as a lawyer, and he couldn't try to build up a practice because he was supporting his mother and sister. So all those jobs are explained by that need to support his mother and sister, and then later my mother and children as they came. He was taking all these civil service exams during the Depression, and he got the offer to be a prison guard in the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. Not something he would ever have thought of doing, but he went and he tried it, and he really, really liked it. He liked the work. He loved living in Connecticut. My mother came, and her mother lived with them, and my one sister was alive at that point, had been born by that point. They lived in a house, not an apartment. They were part of a community, hugely important to him. Something, again, I didn't understand until I began talking to him at length and reading all the materials. That was a huge loss. When he was in Warsaw, he was part of this very tight-knit Hasidic community, and he had lost all that. So he was happy there, my sister was happy, my mother was, everybody was happy there. He was doing so well, he was quickly promoted to parole officer. He then got an offer from another civil service exam he had taken to be alcohol tax inspector. It was supposed to be New Haven, it ended up being Providence. It was a little bit more money, he decided to do it. He was always working side jobs. What he earned never seemed enough, he felt, to support everybody. He was still giving his mother money as well. He goes to tell the warden that he's leaving. The warden is beside himself. You mustn't do that. You are going to be a warden. You'll be a warden in a year. No way, he said. No Jew would ever be appointed warden. There are no Jews. There are no Jewish wardens. The warden said, that's because there were no Jews in the system. You will be a warden. He didn't believe it. He believed that the warden would recommend him for the promotion. He didn't believe that the higher-ups would approve it. He leaves the job, he goes to Providence, it doesn't work out. My mother becomes pregnant with me, so I always felt it was, this terrible thing was somewhat my fault. They come back to New York, and as a sort of stopgap measure, he takes a job as a cutter in the garment industry. He's supposed to, it's supposed to be for a year or less. It ends up being 13 years. 13 years as a cutter. He's active in Liberal Party politics. He keeps getting promised that he's going to be a judge in next year, the next election, after the election, next election, after the election. He did finally get a political appointment, not as a judge, but as assistant counsel to the Workmen's Compensation Board. 6 months later, Rockefeller's elected. There were never Republicans elected in New York, but just in his honor, it's a Republican, and he loses the job. I'm in junior high at this point, but at that point, he did not go back to the factory. He managed to find some way to support the family. My mother went to work for the first time, and he built up a very successful law practice in workers' compensation law. But he never stopped regretting that decision to leave Danbury. When he left, one of his friends, also Jewish, got his job as parole officer, and 1 year later became warden. So all those 13 years in his mind was contrasted with having that professional position that he would have had. And it affected all of us. I mean, the family really did have a sense of regret that I think affected me as well.
God knows what your life would have been like if you had ended up growing up in Danbury.
Well, I'll tell you
in
what,
that house.
it might not have been Danbury. Wardens get moved all over.
Sure.
Yeah. As you heard in introducing me, that my dissertation is New York Jewish conversational style. Although I feel very bad for my father that he had to work those years in the factory, did not in any sense give us the impression that he wasn't happy there. This is something I learned later. One of the many things he said that totally surprised me. I asked him, how did you feel about the work as a cutter? He said, I hated every minute of it. He never put that burden on us. I never understood that. But so when I think about that, he would have been better off, but I wouldn't be a New York Jew. So can't imagine who I would be if not that.
So, two words that describe your father, family and obligation. And it's such an interesting dynamic overall. Talk just a bit about what it was like in Warsaw, where you had this huge family, and the fact that he spent so much of his life feeling this obligation towards his mother. But the fact is, his mother, who clearly had many issues of her own, from what you write about her, probably bipolar, but she did not treat him well in many ways because she resented his father, who had died, and believed that he was too much like his father, I guess, reminded her of his father, and wouldn't give him any help when he needed it, not a dime, took money from him. But he never appeared to show resentment towards her or to feel anything other than this deep-seated sense of obligation. And at the same time, these warm feelings about Warsaw with this large family, it was pretty dysfunctional in a lot of ways. So reflect on that for a minute or two.
Yeah. And I have a whole chapter on Warsaw and so much to say about it. So try to just say a few interesting things here. He was raised in his mother's nuclear family. His mother was the third oldest of at least 16. I was told 18, 20, different numbers, but 13 that I can name and tell you their life stories. And I do tell some of them in the book.
Well, I want to get to some of that because it's fascinating.
Yeah. But fascinating about the family. Because the grandfather was a devout Hasid, all the boys, all the brothers, and my father as a little boy, had to study Talmud. That was the only education they got. So they didn't speak Polish very well, and they had no secular education. The sisters, and my father's explanation was they didn't count. Girls didn't count. They all got higher education. So one is a dentist, one was a mathematician and physicist who studied with Einstein. Maybe we'll talk about her a little bit later. My grandmother had gone to the equivalent of college. Very fascinated. During World War I, there was a German, a well-known German rabbi named Emanuel Karlebach. I'm sure many people have heard of the family Karlebach. He actually came from Germany to help the backward Polish Jews and wanted to start schools. That was his education. That was his interest, education. He hired my grandmother to found, establish, and run the first school for Hasidic girls. So until she did that, my father was 7 when they moved to the school. Until then, they lived in the mother's extended household. There were 9 of her brothers and sisters and the parents. And my father remembered being part of that household with great, great longing. He said, that's what I loved most, the warmth, the liveliness of all these aunts and uncles. One of the favorite things to do when we would go over his past was list all the aunts and uncles. And he would tell me all his memories about them, and we would talk about what happened to them. I think part of the reason he had such fond memories is that there were women in that household who were very kind to him, as his mother never was. His grandmother was very loving to him. And I can remember he was telling me about her. He would have been like 96 or 7 at this time. And he would tear up. And for a second, I thought, he's 97, and she died when he was 10, before he came to this country. And then I thought, of course, she was somebody who really made him feel loved. He had memories of being put to bed. They always would go away for the summer to the country. And he had this very detailed memory. He must have been 4 years old, and they put him to bed in another room, and it was cold, and the mattress was made of straw. And he said he felt so unhappy and abandoned, and his grandmother came in. And he said, I don't know, maybe she suspected how I felt, and she sang to him. So I think that's part of it. And then he had this aunt who was only 6 years older, who was also very kind to him and protected him from his mother. And when they moved to the school, his mother had a series of servants whom she'd always fight with, and then they'd leave, but they would be very kind to him. So I think that is a big part of what that meant to him. But the kind of PS to the story. So he had these very fond memories of that family. One of the aunts, his sister, the one 6 years older, who was more like a sister, she never left Poland, and she had gotten swept up in the Bolshevik Revolution and was very active as a communist. She spent 8 years in prison as a communist, and she survived World War II because she was in prison near the Russian border. When the Germans came into the townspeople, the guards apparently left the communists there, but the townspeople let them out. She got over the border to Russia. And so she came back to Poland after the war and was very high up in the Polish government. My father bombarded her with letters asking questions about the family. And I have a letter that she wrote to him. It's in Polish. I translated it, had it translated. She says, I can't share your nostalgia for the family, the warmth. I guess he used that word. There was no warmth in our family. And it's the Hasidic tradition that is the key, I think, to all the dysfunction in that family. The grandfather had been married to a woman who he apparently loved. They were betrothed. It was an arranged marriage, but apparently he really loved her. She died in childbirth. According to tradition, he had to marry her sister. Her sister was 14. Again, these huge families. They waited until she was 15, and then they married. And as this aunt said, he never liked her, and he treated her as someone imposed on him. My father remembered thinking that his grandfather's name was Zazagit, because she always spoke to him by beginning with Zazagit. It was be so good. She was being deferential to him. And this aunt said, who had also adored her mother, said that he always treated her badly, even though he had 23 children born with her. She was pregnant all the time. And I think that that really is key to some of the dysfunction in that family.
So I'm so struck by the fact that in this patriarchal society, that because the boys all spent all of their time praying and studying Talmud, that they let the girls shine in a way. It's not the image that we tend to have in these societies. It's not like the image of Yentl, for example. But you had, it obviously was an incredibly talented family, including your grandmother, who had taken over the school and done so well, but then came to the United States and didn't have those opportunities. But you write a lot about the accomplishments of these aunts. And the one you mentioned, who became a top official in the Communist Party in Poland and a governmental official with her husband. But you have to share for a minute the physicist, the story of the physicist, which makes a lot of sense, even if people are going to be quizzical about the ties to Albert Einstein.
Yes. Her name was Dora, and she was one of the middle sisters. She went to Switzerland to study. She was a mathematician. She was referred to as a mathematician, but apparently studied both mathematics and physics in Switzerland. My father visited her with his mother on the way to the United States because she was still there. The story from the family was that she had been his lover in Switzerland. She came to the United States fairly shortly after my father went, and he remembers being with his mother and several of the other aunts and uncles who were actually aunts. I'm sorry, it was aunts. It was the women relatives sitting around. And he remembered hearing her tell this to her sisters. And she said that Einstein had told her that she was one of only 10 people in the world who truly understood his theory of relativity. So I remember thinking, yeah, maybe he said that to all the young women that he seduced. I had written to several of the biographers of Einstein, and one of them said it didn't surprise him that he did have affairs with his students. But that was only the beginning. When Einstein came and lived in Princeton, she went to Princeton to be with him. And again, the sister, one of the sisters was a dentist, the first woman dentist in Newark, New Jersey, and first woman periodontist in Newark, New Jersey. She told my father that she had gotten a letter from Dora saying that she was pregnant by Einstein and needed an abortion, and was asking for her sister's advice, which makes sense because it was an older sister and she was a medical professional and had been in this country a long time. She was one of the first ones to come. Okay, so yeah, this is the kind of thing people tell, stories that they make up. Yeah, maybe she met him once and then it gets blown up. But I did find lots of evidence that this was true. I found evidence of her degrees from Switzerland. Walter Isaacson had written a biography of Einstein, so I emailed him and asked if he had come across her name. And he almost immediately sent me a link to a handwritten letter of recommendation that Einstein had written for her. It's in German, saying he's known her for many years. She's a very talented mathematician and physicist. She's a great educator. So clearly there was a relationship there. And another cousin ran into someone who had been a close friend of Einstein's and asked him if he knew her, and he said, oh yeah, she had changed her name to Corlett with Cornblith. Oh yeah, Corley, she was one of Einstein's girls. So there's a fair amount of evidence that it was true. And what my father, again, had always been told by his aunt was that she really believed that Einstein was going to marry her when his wife died. And when he didn't, she was devastated, and she went as far away as she could and went to California. All the rest of the family was in New York. And then the last really sad ending of this, and it's so much like experience of so many immigrants, I think especially women. She never was able to work get a teaching job in this country. The 1940 census, she's in Princeton, has her as a houseworker. I don't know what, my father thought that she had worked as a governess, maybe that's what it was. But I have a letter, again, all these letters my father says, I don't know where he even got this letter, but it's a letter from Dora, again to her sister, saying that she has hit upon a way she thinks she can support herself. She is crocheting baby jackets, and she says there people really love them. She has matching jackets for the baby and the mother, and if she can break into the Hollywood market, she thinks that she'll be able to do okay.
That is such a stunning story about the fate of immigrants, women and men with advanced degrees and incredible competence who ended up in doing more menial things. When I read this story, my first thought was, if she hadn't had the abortion, imagine what that child would have been like. Probably a Nobel Prize in physics, at least at this point.
Unfortunately, back in those days, she
Yeah.
probably would have given it up for adoption.
Yes, yes. So now let's talk about your father and your mother and the mysterious other woman. And I want to start by going back to the obligation. Your father thought he would never marry, thought he couldn't marry because he had these obligations to his mother and his sister. And yet ended up getting married, and in some ways with grave misgivings, but out of another sense of obligation that also gets us to the whole issue of sexual politics in that era of the Depression and its immediate aftermath. So weave that story a little bit for us.
Yes. Oh, goodness. I spent so much time on this one. And I have a whole chapter on it. In a way, it's the most gripping chapter, I think. It ended up
Yes.
being like a thriller. Yeah. My parents both made reference to Helen. They referred to her as my mother's rival. And it was casual. It wasn't, they'd been married at this point so many years that there was no sense of jealousy or anything. But when I spoke with my father about it, every time I would talk about my mother, he would mention Helen would come up. So I said one time, I referred to my mother as his other girlfriend. She said, your mother wasn't my girlfriend. Helen was my girlfriend. And then another time I said something, were you dating mommy at this time too? Oh, I never dated your mother. Well, maybe the last year I was sort of like a boyfriend, but we used to be together all the time. So I was really curious about what this situation was. At one point he said to me that he had saved Helen's letters, but he no longer knew where they were. Well, that really piqued my curiosity, because if I could read the letters, I could get a sense of what their relationship was. He did, so one time I'm with him, he said he's going to go to the storage room. I said, I'll go with you. He said, fine. And when we get there, he finds what he's looking for. And then I said, how about we look for those letters? And he said, fine. And it looked like I had looked in all the boxes. My father's very organized, so it didn't take that long to check everything. Everything was labeled. But I reached for the last box, up in the corner. I pull it away from the wall, and I hear a plop. I reach behind, and here's the letters. And also, there are these pages in there, and it turns out he also kept copies of many of his letters to her. So I do know something about what that relationship was like. But the comment my father would make when we talked about it, and even my mother would make reference to this, he thought that Helen was a virgin. If he had known, he discovered she was not a virgin. She sent him a card that told him that she actually had not been a virgin all the time. They dated for 3 years. And he married my mother on impulse. It was not like it was planned. And I'll tell us in a minute about how he happened to marry her. But so he got this letter telling him that Helen had not been a virgin. Had he known that, he would have married her. Now, how could that be? It's such a mystery. This is the explanation, and again, the story about sexual politics at the time, and so heartbreaking about what women had to deal with
Yeah.
at that time with the issue of virginity. If a woman was not a virgin, she was unmarriageable, in theory. Nobody would marry her. So a man who had ethics and scruples would never sleep with a virgin because he would ruin her. My father, of course, had scruples and felt his sense of obligation to people, as you say so strongly. So he would never have sex with Helen because he believed she was a virgin. Meanwhile, he did have sex with my mother the last year. How did that happen? My mother was the younger sister of his best friend. She had 3 brothers. He was very unhappy at home. His situation with his mother and sister was very unpleasant. His sister was mentally ill. His mother probably was too, as you say. But my mother was always there, and so he went there to hang out with the brothers, but he was put in contact with my mother. She was very open about it. She told me herself. She took a liking to him. She pretty much fell in love with him when she was 13 and he was 15. And she said, I can't believe how aggressive I was. I was always trying to get him to spend time with me. He got a job. The people who owned the factory where he worked as a kid started a finance company. He had been to law school for a year at this point. They hired him to run it. And he was doing very well for the Depression. So he gave jobs to all the brothers and to my mother. So she then is working in the office where he works. One thing she told me is that when Helen would call, she would tell Helen he wasn't in. She's with him all the time, and she said she would always try to get him to go to lunch with her, try to get him to go to dinner with her. And apparently what happened is she confessed to him that she was not a virgin. She had been engaged to someone else. And she told me, all my friends, she said, were sleeping with their fiancés. We didn't talk about it, but we all knew it. So she apparently said to my father, you would not be obligated because I'm not a virgin. And he, believed that. Once they're having sex, she started saying, we have to get married.
Yeah.
And he really felt he couldn't. He kept saying he couldn't because he was sole support of his mother and sister. He was barely managing, it was the Depression, he was barely managing to support them. The finance company had by this time gone under. So how could he do that? But apparently she started crying from morning until night. She couldn't keep food down. She was so upset. She was throwing up. She was losing weight. And he felt it was his fault. And he had to do the right thing. And so he decides on impulse, let's get married. And apparently, again, this is her speaking. The first 2 times I said, no, you're only saying it because you think I want it. And then the 3rd time she said, let's do it. So they get married at City Hall. Apparently their plan was to keep the arrangement the way it was. She was going to live at home. He was going to marry, live with his mother and sister and continue to support them. But while they were gone, advertisements had come to her house, and her father found out, and then they had a Jewish wedding, and they were married. So the way I tended to think about it when I first heard about this was that my mother had tricked him, which in a way I guess she did. I don't know that she thought it through. But what did he mean if he had known Helen wasn't a virgin, he would have married her? Had he known that, he would have had sex with her and then probably would have gone ahead and married her the same way he went ahead and married my mother once he knew.
But just the dilemma for women at the time, I think for most men, they probably wouldn't have thought twice about sleeping with somebody if they had the chance and then just going off. But your father did have that sense of obligation. Did he feel, or did he express to you the sense that your mother had been manipulative?
No.
Because from everything that you write in the chapter, including how she would say to him, come spend a couple of hours with me and then make sure that he spent many, many more. It didn't sound like he felt any regret or resentment about that.
He never expressed any regret or resentment. And I have to say, when I read the letters, I fell in love with Helen myself. She was wonderful. She was an intellectual, as my father was. She was a beautiful writer. She was interested in ideas, and she quotes poetry. And my mother wasn't interested in that kind of thing. She also didn't graduate from high school, which doesn't mean anything. My father didn't either. But no, he never did. And I often tried to get him to say that he would have preferred to marry Helen, or that he would have preferred to marry my mother if he had to choose one. He never would. And what he always would say is, it doesn't matter whom you marry. The difference is whether you're married or not. If you're married, you're obligated, you have to make a living. If you're not married, you're free. And that was his dream, to be free, that his mother and sister would marry. And he said, that was my paradise. What would be the worst that could happen? If I was starving, I might end up in jail. Well, that's not so bad. They feed you, they give you a place to sleep. That was what he dreamed of. And I think in many ways I felt Helen would have been a better wife, but I'm thinking of my idea of marriage. Soulmate. I don't think he thought of it that way. I also think I completely changed my feeling about my mother tricking him into marriage. Honestly, I think she saved him. His mother was not going to get married. She never did. His sister did. She never did. She never would. He would have been one of these guys that stays living with his mother, miserable, but feeling that he has to support her. And she was miserable. I found in a letter that he wrote, he describes how she just spent the whole day lying on the couch. He describes her, he's a wonderful writer, so everything he described you could really see. Her hair unkempt, wearing the same dirty house dress day after day, her stockings falling down, one all the way down and the other halfway down. I mean, she's depressed, and so my mother saved him from that, gave him a life. He was very happy having his own family. He came to love her very much, and she saved his mother. His mother went out to work, and I'm sure was happier.
So did you ever try and reach out to Helen as you were doing this? You have any idea what happened to her?
You know, when my father was alive, he said if he only knew that Helen had gotten married, his conscience would be clear. He often just said how guilty. He said, I feel guilty to this day. You know, he said, I remember asking him once, how did you feel deciding to get married? He said, well, I was doing the right thing, but I had to betray the other one, and I feel bad about it to this day. So I tried, hired a private investigator. But I didn't succeed. And once he was gone,
So we're going to turn to questions in a minute, but I have one more thing I'd like to ask you, which is, in this book, it's not just about your father or your mother. There's a lot about you. And you opened up here with some candor about your own life. What moved you to do that? You could easily have written this without bringing yourself into it. Although you were obviously as well an integral part of his life, and you meant so much to him, and he was extraordinarily proud of what you had done with your own life and career. But talk about what made you this time write so much about yourself.
I have to say that is, again, something that was not what I started out thinking I was going to do. In fact, I was resistant to being called a memoir. I said, no, it's not. It's a biography of my father. But I realized that what it was meaning to me was its connection to me. When I would come across things about him that reminded me of myself, that was very resonant for me. And I have to give credit to my editor for pushing me to do that. You know, It's funny, she would often say, how did this make you feel? And I thought, well, what is this, therapy? But then I realized, yes, that she's right. That's what readers will want to know, and that's really what I want to know. So I have always used anecdotes, personal anecdotes in all my books.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was more revealing of my own frailties
Yes.
and my own tendency to be terribly unhappy, as my mother definitely was. I always thought I had got it from my mother, but reading my father's journals, I realized that that was true of him as well.
So I would just say this book is gripping. At times it's almost reading a novel. It's a reflection of people. There are some wonderful stories in it we couldn't get to, including involving the FBI. But this is not just about an individual. It's about a century, and it's about not just a family, but about human dynamics. So it's a marvelous, marvelous book, one of many you've written, but different than the others.
Thank you so much, Norm.
Let's open up to questions, and we'll let Suzanne curate.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you, and thanks for sharing your story. We're going to start with a question. Somebody would like to know, do you know how common it was for Jews in the United States in the 20s through the 50s to be members of the Communist Party? And somebody else asked, was your dad still a communist when he ran for Congress?
Yeah, thank you. That's great. I do have a whole chapter about his politics. I don't think a large percentage of Jews were communists, but a large percentage of communists were Jews, as I understand it. And Norm may know more about this than I do. I was quite astonished. I read about it, again, in connection with writing this book. I read a lot about the period. There were not that many members of the Communist Party at all. The highest number that I found anywhere was maybe 100,000. When you hear about the McCarthy era and the fear, the terror of communists, there were not that many of them. No, my father was disillusioned with communism and quit the party in 1939 when Stalin made a pact with Hitler, and I know many others did at that time too. So by the time I was born, it was just something I was supposed to keep secret. Don't tell anyone your father was a communist. When I sat down, and I have this on tape to interview him about, I said, today we're going to talk about your political life. And he said, at the risk of arrest and deportation. And I laughed, and I said, oh, by the time I write my book, no one's going to care. It was, again, like so many things. In retrospect, I felt that was really naive because many Jews, when people were discovered to be communists, many were arrested and many were deported, as Emma Goldman very famously was. But yeah, and I can tell you about his FBI file. But I'll tell you the brief story about the FBI file. It turns out that somebody denounced him when he worked at the prison, and he was no longer a communist at that point. And so the FBI did this great investigation. I don't know a whole lot about it because most of the pages of the file are either blacked out or left out. But the conclusion of it is there that they did not find that they did not find any record of his having been a communist, so they never exposed him. Had they, then he would have lost the job.
Thank you. How and why did your father's family decide to leave Warsaw and come to the United States?
Yes, and this too is something I didn't really understand until reading about it myself. Poverty. In World War, the family was quite comfortable before World War I. The grandfather, first he had a furniture store, which apparently he wanted to have more time to study Talmud, so he sold his share of the store and was lending money as a way to support this very large family. After World War I, it was not possible to have stores. It wasn't possible to. He lost everything that he had lent to people. They refused to pay back, and he was not in a position to force them to. In World War I, the Poles took back their control of the government, and they were more anti-Semitic. So, for example, there was one uncle who had remained part of the, who had remained Hasidic, and he married a woman. She was a widow. She had a couple kids, but she had a tobacco store, so it was a way they could live. Well, once the Polish government came into power, Jews were not allowed to do anything, civil service, and they nationalized tobacco. So they were destitute. So it was poverty. My father, again, he was a kid, so his perspective was that of a kid. He thought that his mother was comfortable, had a comfortable position running the school. In fact, she was supporting the family. She was giving her money to her father. The only other source of income he had was money sent from the United States by the by the ones that were already there. I found letters that his mother had exchanged with Rabbi Karlebach, who's back in Germany. The salaries they were paying the teachers was not enough for them to buy food. The school was actually crumbling. It did stay, by the way. It did stay. That school did stay in operation even into the ghetto, but it was the poverty. There was really no way for Jews to earn a living anymore.
Thank you. We now have a question bringing the discussion forward to today. RGB was an example of someone who spoke softly in the realm of public discourse. So how was it that she was able to make herself heard?
Let me say, she's from the same neighborhood in Brooklyn that I'm from. Very proud of that. I don't know that I have an expert opinion on this, but I'll tell my opinion, and maybe Norm can add his. Because she had a platform based on her knowledge and her work, I would say. She didn't, the fact that she argued cases before the Supreme Court gave her a platform. And certainly she was not easy to get that platform. It was not easy for any women to graduate from law school when she did, or accomplish any of the things she did. But she kept at it and got herself into positions where she was able to speak from the position of knowledge and the position of authority that she'd been given. Would you say something else about that, Norm?
I guess a couple of things. One is for a woman to be a lawyer as she grew up, and we know this from Sandra Day O'Connor as well, it was a little bit like it was for your father as a Jew and a lawyer, where most law firms were not going to go anywhere near them, and that was true of women. So she had to overcome an awful lot. But what we saw, of course, was somebody not just with steely determination, but absolutely brilliant at being able to take arguments and frame them in the appropriate way. And when she went after the discrimination against women, she started by looking at cases where there was discrimination against men, that she thought judges would be more open to understanding, and then use that to shoehorn it in. And she had a great deal of success that way. But of course, what I find so interesting now is the degree to which she became a popular icon. And, the notorious RBG and all of that. And a part of it is people outside who managed to frame it in the right way. But it was also the way she looked. She didn't look like a woman who was going to change the world. She looked like a frail, shy grandmother, and that she could do what she did while looking that way. The composite of the figure, I think, vaulted her into a position where she could be featured in parody on Saturday Night Live and on Pillows and everywhere else. We won't see the likes of that again, I think, for a very long time.
I would add the Talmudic tradition of argumentation is probably, I don't think she was trained in that, but I think it's somewhere there in the heritage. It probably played a role.
I would just add, I knew her some, and knew her fairly well. And a few times, Judy, my wife, and I would end up having a meal with her and Marty, her husband. And sometimes it was just by accident. We were at a reception together, or we were at the theater together. Um, he was the most outgoing, lively, funny, just a whirlwind. And he would dominate a conversation, and she was painfully shy. And every time we would sit down, she would ask me about Robert Bork, who at that point was a colleague of mine and who had been on the Court of Appeals with her. And of course, the exact opposite ideologies, but she felt uh, he was a friend, and she knew that he had been scarred deeply by what happened on the Supreme Court. And her first instinct was to ask about her friend and how he was doing. And when Marty died, we, among so many others, thought that this would just leave her devastated, and that she would kind of move into a shell. And it had the opposite effect. She came out and became so much more active socially on her own, going to the theater, going to the opera that she loved, but also just becoming more outgoing and showing the personality that at times you didn't see if you were just with her in a social way. And but also just showing this incredible level of kindness and empathy, that joined with that strong, fierce sense of social justice. Really quite a remarkable person, and there aren't very many like that. And it's an interesting question to ask, because your father had some of that brilliance, had a lot of that determination, and I think there were just a whole lot of people who came out of that generation, and even a little bit after, who really did remarkable things in the world.
Yeah, my father's positive memories are almost all around his writing. You know, he didn't like the job, but he wrote really good reports and did well. And yeah, so that thinking things through, writing, being able to use words.
But he also, his law practice was in workman's compensation.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so he gravitated, he did very well financially, but it was helping people who
Absolutely.
were screwed by the system, basically.
Yeah.
So
In fact,
he made sure that he did a legal practice that also fit into the Jewish tradition of
yes,
doing good
yes,
and
yes.
helping people.
Even I think communism was tikkun olam.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
really thought that it was going to bring about a just world and an end to anti-Semitism, because all workers would unite. So, yeah, definitely. When my father left the practice, he retired at 70. It was because his original partners had passed away, and he felt that the young lawyers in the firm didn't care about the workers, and that just bothered him.
So we need to wrap this up, unfortunately. I know we could go on and on. We have one last question that we will end with. You wrote The Argument Culture over 20 years ago, and it's quite hard to believe how relevant the topic is today. Is there something in your book that you wrote that would still be a great lesson for us today?
Oh boy, yeah. I remember thinking when I published that book that I had waited too long to publish it. It took me too long. It's going to be, the moment will have passed, and the only thing that's happened is the moment has gotten more relevant. The basic point of the book is, if you take adversarial stances, that does not lead you to truth. It has a corrosive effect on the human spirit, and it makes it harder to solve problems because you're thinking of everything as polarized extremes. So, as the question has said, it is just more relevant today than it was then, heartbreakingly.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, thank you, Norm. Thank you, Deborah. This was a really wonderful conversation. I encourage everybody, you can find the book at Amazon as well as your local bookshops. We will also send a link to this recording along with a specific link where you can find exactly in your area where to purchase the book. We hope that you will join us next week for our musical tribute to Elie Wiesel. Please also,
holding it
you
up.
can, yes, there's the copy of a cover of the book. And again, if you've enjoyed today's program, we ask that you consider going to momentmag.com and make a donation to help us do more of these types of programs. Again, thank you both, and we will see you next week.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you. Thank you, Norm.